Hey guys, I'm Melissa, and welcome to Murder, She Crocheted, the podcast where we unravel some dark truths, often one thread at a time. Today's case is heavy, but it's one that needs to be told. We're taking a deep dive into the tragic case of Irene Garza, a case that highlights not just the horror of one woman's murder, but the systemic failures and the institutional cover-ups that delayed justice for over 5 decades. This is a story about betrayal, about power, but ultimately about persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. This case is going to get heavy, like they all do. So if you need to take breaks, please take care of yourself first. I will be here when you come back. Before we dive into the case, let's take a second to kind of ground ourselves with this week's crochet project. We're working on the sunflower granny square using Cheryl Bennett's Sunburst Granny Square pattern, and of course it will be linked in the notes below. If you're watching on YouTube, this is what it'll end up looking like if you choose to use the sunflower colors. I say sunflower. You can use whatever colors you like on this. I've made them with daisies where the center is white, and then we go out to a kind of this bright yellow and then to a pale yellow. For this one, I'll be using brown and then gold, bright yellow. And then the outside, this color, mine's purple. You get to pick whatever color you want, but choose something you like because this is going to end up being the main color of the project. This week, we're just making the granny squares. We'll need 13 of them. And next week, we'll put them all together in the project for that episode. Over on my TikTok, Instagram, well, over on all of my socials, I did a short video kind of walking you through how to make them. It wasn't a tutorial. I, wasn't showing you how to make a double crochet. But it's just a quick walkthrough of how each row is kind of constructed. And yeah, so like I said, pick color that you want. Crochet is customizable. That's the best part about crocheting. So now with yarn in hand, let's begin. Irene Garza's murder is not just another true crime story. It's a narrative about systemic failure and the consequences of institutional betrayal. Irene was a dedicated teacher, a devout Catholic, and a respected member of her community. She met a tragic end at the hands of a man she and her community trusted. His name was Father John Bernard Fate. The story exposes some deep flaws in law enforcement and religious institutions, flaws that allowed a murderer to evade justice for over 5 decades. In today's episode, we'll look closely at the events leading up to her death, the botched investigation. I don't know why that was so hard for me to say. The botched investigation, the cover-ups, and the eventual, though very long delayed, triumph of justice. Not only did I research this case and court documents extensively, I also had the privilege to speak to the Texas Ranger who was responsible for seeing this case to the end and making sure that Irene got justice. His account was eye-opening, and I could honestly tell how important this case was to him. I had never heard of this murder. It was not one of the cases that was, I don't want to say sensationalized, but kind of sensationalized. There are the cases that we've all heard of, the Bundy case, Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, Night Stalker. And we've heard of those. I didn't want to cover them. I know that sounds kind of silly, but we've heard them, right? And I wanted to talk about cases that maybe were not as well known and maybe deserved to be more known. So I kind of didn't know where to start when I was looking for my very first case on my very first episode of my very first podcast. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm sure you can tell that I am in a hotel bed. I am currently in McAllen, Texas for the Texas Public Safety Conference. I work in 911 emergency dispatch. And so I'm here this week. I'm teaching. I'm terrified. I don't public speak well. So I said to myself, you're going to McAllen. See if there's anything down south that maybe you can talk about. So to the interwebs I flew. And lo and behold, I found the case of Irene Garza. When I started digging, I couldn't stop. This case is just, it's heartbreaking, and it's infuriating, but there's a happy ending. I'll give you spoilers. There's a happy ending. And when you research something, you want to get everything you can. And so I did open records requests, and I pulled every report or photo or account that I could. And I knew that there was a Texas Ranger that worked on this case. I knew that he was retired. And so I wanted to tell you guys a little bit about him. And I Googled him to see whatever I could find. And I happened upon a contact email for him. And I said, you know what? I'm going to shoot my shot. The worst he can say is no. But he didn't say no. He said yes. And he took the time to speak to me and really make sure that I understood the case and the nuance. And I could tell by the sound of his voice that this was something he was passionate about. And so I hung up the phone after I talked to him, and number one, I was just giddy, happy as a clam, because I felt like a real podcaster. I'd done my first interview. But I also kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say I was in awe, but I was just kind of in awe of this Ranger's dedication and passion for this case. But we'll get into that later. Sorry, I'm rambling. So, getting to know who Irene was. Irene was born on November 15th, 1934 in McAllen, Texas, to Nicholas and Josefina Garza. Her parents owned a successful dry cleaning business, and Irene grew up in a supportive, loving household that allowed her to flourish both academically and socially. Her parents' success with the dry cleaning business allowed the family to move to the other side of town, the more affluent side of town, if you will. They did this in order to provide their children with the best education that they could, which, isn't that every parent's goal, is to do the best for their kid? Irene made history by becoming the first Latina twirler and head drum majorette at McAllen High School, where she would later graduate. In 1958, she was crowned Miss All South Texas Sweetheart. Man, that's a mouthful. She was also a homecoming queen at Pan American College, which is now known as UTPA, University of Texas Pan America. Professionally, Irene worked as a second grade teacher at Thigpen Elementary School. And she was also the secretary of the PTA, or Parent Teacher Association. Naomi Ponce Ziegler, one of Irene's cousins, I believe, extended family, told 48 Hours in their interview, oftentimes she would use part of her salary to buy the kids' school supplies or to buy them things that they needed. Another cousin of Irene's, Linda Delavina, says that she remembers the last time she talked to Irene that fateful Easter weekend. She said one of the things she talked about was that she had Easter baskets for us. And my brother and I were excited and jumping up and down because we knew that she would not have forgotten about us. Irene was deeply committed to her faith and regularly attended Sacred Heart Catholic Church. In a letter that she wrote to her friend shortly before her death, Irene described herself as extremely shy, but she said she had started feeling more confident in both her work and personal life. Irene was only 25. She was 25 years old when she was killed. She'd already done so much and had such a great reputation for being 25. I don't know what y'all were doing at 25, but I was not this. So on the evening of April 16th, 1960, Irene told her parents she was going to Sacred Heart Catholic Church in McAllen. It was the night before Easter Sunday, and she was planning to attend confession in preparation for the Holy Day. This was a regular practice for Irene. Like I said earlier, she was a devout Catholic. She left the family home. She was wearing a white blouse, a skirt, matching heels, remember that later, carrying her purse and a lace veil to wear over her head during confession. Her parents said that she had a sense of peace about the upcoming holiday, but little did they know that that would be the last time her family would ever see her alive. When Irene didn't return home that evening, her parents became increasingly worried. This was not behavior that was normal for Irene. They said it was completely out of character for their daughter, who was responsible and punctual. An hour passed without any sign of her, and they feared the worst. Her parents decided to drive to the church, and they found her car. As soon as they saw her car, their concerns were immediately validated. By early the next morning, and by morning I mean around midnight, 1 a.m., on April 17th, they reported her missing to the McAllen Police Department. At first, there was hope that maybe she had just lost track of time or gotten delayed, but that hope quickly faded as hours turned into days, with still no sign or word from Irene. The search for Irene Garza intensified almost immediately. Family, friends, community members, everybody joined law enforcement in scouring the area for any sign of her. On April 18th, 2 days after her disappearance, a series of troubling discoveries were made. Irene's personal belongings, her black purse, one of her high heel shoes, and her lace veil were found scattered along a roadside in McAllen. This roadside was not far from Sacred Heart Church, raising immediate concerns that something had happened to her after she left the church that night. During the initial days of the investigation, there were several false leads. A woman falsely claimed to be Irene, telling authorities that she had been kidnapped and taken to a hotel. Which I don't understand, people. Like, somebody's family is missing and you're being a douchebag. So that claim was quickly debunked and revealed as a hoax. In another instance, a local man who was very drunk, and I mean very drunk, made an offhand comment claiming that he had killed Irene. Investigators dismissed the remark after determining that there was no evidence. There was no way that this man had killed Irene. How they determined that, I don't know, but they did. Despite the distractions, the search continued, growing bigger and bigger with more urgency from the community. As days passed, law enforcement and volunteers widened their search efforts, combing through fields and canals and any isolated area near McAllen. On April 21st, 5 days after Irene was last seen, her body was discovered. She was found floating in the canal, miles from where her belongings had been. Trigger warning, we're about to talk about the crime scene. The scene was grim. Irene was fully clothed, except for her shoes and her underwear, but her blouse was unbuttoned. Her body showed visible signs of injury. She had severe bruising on both sides of her eyes and the right side of her face, suggesting that she had been beaten or bludgeoned with something. The autopsy would later confirm that she had been sexually assaulted while unconscious and then suffocated. Investigators at the time had very little to go on. Not only this murder shook them, but it shook the community. Like, everybody loved Irene, and now she was dead. There were no eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, and DNA analysis was still decades away. Detectives decided to drain the canal a couple weeks later, and they found a clue. In addition to Irene's body, investigators recovered 2 candlestick holders from the canal. The candlesticks belonged to Sacred Heart Church, but I want you to bookmark that in your brain, that investigators found those candlesticks, because we're going to talk about that in a minute. But in addition to the candlesticks, they found a green slide viewer with a long black cord. Now, despite this critical evidence, investigators at the time failed to compare the candlestick holders to the bruises on Irene's body to see if they might have been weapons used to inflict her injuries. It was one of many, many missed opportunities that would plague this investigation. Doctors C.E. Gordon and H.E. Wingham performed the autopsy, and the results painted a devastating picture of Irene's final moments. Due to the length of the time that her body had been submerged in the water of the canal, much of the physical evidence that would have helped link a suspect to the crime was destroyed. Even still, it was clear that she had suffered in her final hours. Like I said, the discovery of Irene's body shocked the McAllen community. This wasn't just a murder. It was a brutal, senseless killing of a woman who was deeply loved and respected. Her death marked the beginning of a very long and painful journey for her family, who would spend the next 57 years. I want you to hear that, 57 years fighting for answers and justice. And even though the search for Irene had ended with the discovery of her body, the search for the truth had just begun. As the investigation into Irene Garza's murder unfolded, several pieces of evidence and witness accounts led the police to focus on a man named John Bernard Fate, or as most of the parishioners of Sacred Heart Catholic Church knew him, Father John Fate. He rapidly became the police's prime suspect. So let's talk about Father Fate. Father John Bernard Fate was a young, charismatic priest who had been ordained in the Catholic Church in the 1950s. He was born in Chicago in 1932, and he grew up in a devout Catholic household. And from an early age, he was considered intelligent, articulate, and deeply committed to his faith. Or so it seemed. After completing his seminary studies, Fate was ordained as a priest and quickly gained a reputation within the church as someone with great potential. However, behind the scenes, troubling patterns were starting to emerge. Fate had already exhibited some behavior that raised concerns among some of his superiors. In particular, he struggled with boundaries and self-control, specifically when it came to interactions with young women. Despite these red flags, he was assigned to various parishes in Texas, moving from one to another in common practice within the church to avoid the scandals. By 1960, Fate had been temporarily assigned to Sacred Heart Catholic Church in McAllen during the busy Easter season. Sacred Heart was a large and active parish in the Rio Grande Valley, and the church was particularly crowded that time of year as parishioners prepared for the Easter holiday. Fate's role there was simply to assist with confessions and maybe some other small duties, helping the overwhelmed clergy manage the influx of congregants. Though he was only meant to be a temporary addition to the parish, his temporary presence had tragic consequences. So we've talked about him a little bit. Let's get back to the case and we'll touch on him again. So like I said earlier, one of the most significant discoveries that was found with her body was the portable slide viewer. Investigators traced that slide viewer back to Father Fate. 2 days after they discovered the slide viewer, the police received a note from Father Fate himself that says, quote, "This viewer belongs to John Fate, Order of Mary Immaculate of San Juan, Texas. It was purchased in Port Isabel, Texas in July 1959 at Freddy's Professional Pharmacy. Terms cash, price I don't remember." End quote. Come on, y'all. Fate also said that he had bought it and lost it the summer before, and he wasn't sure how it ended up with Irene's body. I'm sorry, I'm not a wizard and I'm not pretending to know everybody's life. You know, I'm not the end all be all. But how do you lose something almost a year prior and it magically turns up with the body of a dead young woman who was at your church the night before she died? Is that suspicious? Is that fishy to anybody else? Just me? All right. It was a personal item, obviously, that he owned, not the church, him, and witnesses confirmed that he had used it frequently. So people saw him with it. You didn't lose it last summer, John. The fact that it was found discarded near Irene's body was damning, obviously, and it placed him directly at the scene of where her body was disposed of. In addition to that, he had also heard Irene's confession the night she disappeared. Parishioners that were at the church that night noted that Fate's confessional line was long and was moving unusually slowly. He was absent from the confessional for long periods of time. This was in part because the priest had taken Irene to hear her confession in the rectory. Now, if you don't know, the rectory is a residence provided by the church for the priest in charge of the parish or other priests or clergymen in the parish. It usually serves as the priest's home and place for parish-related meetings or duties. Now, this is not somewhere that confessions are usually heard. It's like he invited her into his home to hear her confession, is what that boils down to. Now, Father Fate initially denied hearing her confession at the rectory, but then later admitted to having done so. This guy's a really bad liar. He said that his absence from the sanctuary that parishioners were reporting was because his glasses were broken. He allegedly used to play with his glasses nervously while he listened to confession, and it was said that he did this often. Father Fate's account of the events was that at 7 p.m. on Holy Saturday, the night before Easter, he and Father O'Brien, another priest in the church, were leaving the rectory when the phone rang. Father Fate answered it, and Irene was on the other end. She asked to speak to Father Junius, who was hearing confession at the church. Father Fate told her that Junius was busy until about 10:30, but he would talk to her if she could come in. Irene arrived and discussed, quote, a personal problem with Fate, and then Fate sent Garza to the church to go to confession. He says he accompanied Garza when she left the rectory, and then he went to hear confessions. Now, what happens next is where his story diverges from what others report significantly. At about 8 p.m., he got the rectory keys from Father O'Brien and went for a break. He said he returned to the church at 8:15, and he began to get hoarse at about 9 p.m. and returned to the rectory for a cigarette and some soda. He was hoarse, like his voice was hoarse, so he wants to smoke a cigarette. I know that the 50s were a different time, y'all, but make it make sense. I guess the 60s. The 60s were a different time still. He said he then returned to church to hear confession, but the people in the church who were waiting to go to confession said that Faith's line stopped moving at about 8, and after that there was no sign of a priest in the confessional at all. Faith said that at about 9:50, he noticed that a screw had fallen out of his eyeglasses. He told Father Bursch that he would have to go to San Juan to get his other glasses. Faith said that when he arrived at San Juan, he discovered the building was locked, the rectory where he lived. He had to place a wooden barricade, like a board, against a wall and climb through the second-story window. And he said he scraped his hands while climbing over the wall. I wish that if you're not watching on YouTube, my eyes are trying to roll back in my head. He said he then went back to McAllen and said the Easter Vigil Mass, with the other priests. After the Mass, Father O'Brien noticed that Fate had scratches on his hands. Now, I want you to remember that. That day, Father O'Brien remembered that he had scratches on his hands. On Easter, on the day of Easter, Fate said he went back and forth to the house in San Juan trying to fix his glasses. Law enforcement questioned about 500 people in reference to Irene's murder. That includes sex offenders, Irene's family, co-workers, ex-boyfriends, anybody they could think of. Now, they performed nearly 50 polygraph tests. And I know that now we don't really use those. They're not admissible in court. I get it. However, back then, they were. And even though they're not admissible in court, I still think that sometimes you can get some useful information out of them. I know that they are nerve-wracking. I have taken polygraphs before for work. But sometimes you gotta kick somebody off their game. So out of those 50 polygraphs, 2 of them were given to Father Fate. Initially, it was reported that he passed his polygraphs. And later, it was said that they were actually deemed inconclusive. The polygraph examiner, George Lindbergh, wrote in his report, while being tested, Father Fate limited his breathing to 4 respirations a minute, down from his usual 16 to 20. So he was altering his breath, which honestly is one of the ways that you can pass the test if the examiner's not paying that close of attention. He said, quote, a person who purposely controls his respiration during the examinations is concealing the truth. Mr. Lindbergh told Father Fate to stop, but the priest persisted. He kept doing it. Investigators offered a $2,500 reward. And back in the 60s, that was a lot of money. They got nothing. They later increased it to $10,000. That was the largest reward in the Rio Grande Valley history at the time. But still, they got nothing. Nothing. Her parents, they got nothing. Irene's family was frustrated and losing hope, and it felt like the police were getting nowhere. I can't imagine being Irene's parents. On April 21st, police were made aware of a criminal complaint filed in Edinburgh. Now, if you're not from Texas, Edinburgh is about 25, maybe 20 miles from McAllen, so it's not very far down the road. Police were made aware of a criminal complaint filed in Edinburgh, and Father Fate was the suspect. Surprise, surprise. 3 weeks before Irene's death, there was a woman named Maria America Guerra, and she was sexually assaulted kneeling at the communion rail at another Catholic church in the area. Maria America fought off her attacker and escaped, but she got a good look at him. Now, the rumor was that fate was responsible. I keep saying fate was responsible. I mean Father Fate. It sounds like I'm saying like fate, like your destiny, your fate. No, it's Father Fate. Sorry, tangent. The local church leaders started discouraging people from considering that a priest in their parish could be responsible for such a horrific thing. Insert the eye roll emoji here. Now, Fate admitted to visiting a priest at the church on the day of Maria America's attack, but he denied assaulting her. He said, no, I didn't do it. A couple of weeks after Irene was murdered, Maria America was shown a police lineup, and she picked out Father Fate as her attacker. U.S. Border Patrol agent Harry Cecil questioned Fate about Irene's murder for 12 hours. Fate told Agent Cecil, quote, "You will never convict me of anything," end quote. Now, I wanted to talk about what he said. He didn't say, I didn't do it. He didn't say, you've got the wrong man. He didn't say, oh my goodness, I'm a holy man. How could you ever think I'm responsible for that? Nothing. He said, you will never convict me of anything. If that is not a red flag, I don't know what is. Am I the only one? Y'all let me know. Let me know how you feel about what he said, because I have opinions. Cecil then went to Sacred Heart Church. Agent Cecil went to the church to look at the parish car. Now, it had just been washed on the inside and the out. However, he missed some blood on the seat. McAllen Chief of Police, Clint Mussey, thought that Fate was guilty, but Chief Mussey had been transferred out of town before the investigation was complete, stymieing the police. The lead investigator on the case, Lieutenant Gabriel Cantu, absolutely could not believe that a priest had committed the murder. Immediately after the murder, Father Fate was sent to study at Loyola University in Chicago. So the Catholic Church sent him from Texas to Chicago immediately after the murder of a young girl in his parish. If there have not been like a cascade of red flags yet, like now is when they are flying through the windows like Harry Potter's letters did. Sorry, y'all. This one gets me a little heated. So despite all of the evidence and all of the suspicion, the Catholic Church still protected Father Fate. And I couldn't understand why at first. I couldn't understand why they were so hell-bent on protecting this priest. I mean, I know that they have kind of a history of trying to protect themselves, in scandals. But this one priest, I didn't get it. But you have to think about the year that this happened. The Catholic Church was concerned that a scandal involving the Catholic Church would affect the presidential bid of a certain Catholic man running for president, John F. Kennedy. Now, there is witness testimony that alleges that the Hidalgo County Sheriff, E.E. Vickers, who was a devout Catholic, suggested that the church should hire a private investigator to undermine the murder investigation and thereby avoid a scandal that would rock the presidential campaign. Now, McAllen, the city of McAllen, is in Hidalgo County. Let me clear that up real quick. Sheriff Vickers suggested that a private investigator might compel the district attorney to find a case against Fate weak. And that was actually in a letter in print. I'll link the copy of it in the show notes. The letter was written by Father Joseph Pilecki to the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, Southern Province, in October of 1960. The sheriff of the county was giving the Catholic Church pointers on how to make this investigation not stick. When I told you in the beginning that there was conspiracy and cover-up, I meant it. The call was coming from inside the house. Now, numerous reports indicate Vickers instructed his deputies to turn over records and cease their investigation, even though his public comments were that his detectives would leave no stone unturned. Now, back to Maria America's case against Father Fate. I know I'm kind of jumping, but the timeline matches. The Hidalgo County grand jury that was called on August 10th of 1961 indicted Fate on charges of assault with attempt to rape in connection to the attack on Maria at Sacred Heart Church in Edinburgh on March 23rd of 1960. So after he was indicted for the attempted rape, he was indicted. Fate said he was not bitter and that priests must expect persecution. He said, quote, "Christ told the apostles, 'Know that of the world hates you. It also hated me.'" Y'all, never mind. So, after he was indicted, he disappeared. Imagine that. For several weeks, actually, to an unspecified out-of-state hospital. He eventually surrendered to the police and had his trial venue transferred to Austin, Texas, which is about 4.5 hours away from McAllen. He went to trial on September 12th of 61, and the jury deadlocked, and the judge declared a mistrial. In 1962, they were going to prosecute again, and Fate pled no contest to a reduced charge of aggravated assault and was fined a whole $500, y'all. He was asked if he had anything to say, and all he said was nothing. Later, he claimed not to know, but he had pleaded in court. He also claimed that he had suffered another nervous breakdown in Chicago when JFK was unfortunately assassinated in November of 1963. So, this is the second mental breakdown, third if you count him checking into the unknown hospital. So after this last breakdown, he was sent to a place called Assumption Abbey Monastery. And this monastery was in Missouri. And the reason he was sent there was, quote, for rehabilitation. Now, at the monastery, somebody important enters the chat. Meet Dale Tackney. Dale was a man who left the army in the late 1940s and he joined the Trappists. The Trappists were a Catholic order of monks and nuns that followed the rules of St. Benedict, emphasizing prayer, manual labor, and a life of simplicity and seclusion. He was also called Father Emmanuel at Assumption Abbey. Now in 1963, Tackney received a phone call from the abbot and he said, quote, "There was a priest who murdered a woman in the guest house. He wants to become a monk, and we have been instructed to take him in," end quote. So that's the abbot telling Mr. Tackney that there's a priest who murdered a girl. So the church knew. The church knew the whole time. Sorry, y'all, I had to put my hair up. I have the AC off so it doesn't mess up my audio, but it is toasty in here. Now, anyway, while Fate was at Assumption Abbey, he did something that was, honestly, it surprised me. And he confessed to Dale Tackney. Dale said he expressed no remorse during the confession. Fate told Dale that he heard Irene's confession in the rectory and then, quote, subdued her and took part of her clothes off from the waist up and then fondled her breasts, end quote. He put her in the rectory basement and then returned to church to hear confessions, like nothing was wrong. He then went back to the rectory, gathered her up, and moved her to an apartment that he maintained outside of the church. The next day, Easter, Dale said he put her in a bag in the bathroom. Now, that is not corroborated. Some sources say that he put a bag over her head. I'm not 100% clear on that. Now, but I know that he put her in the bathroom, and as he left, he heard her saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." When he returned later that day on Easter, she was dead. He put her body in the car, quote, patting her on the breast and telling her everything will be okay, end quote. Oh, this man makes me sick. Like my stomach is turning. So Fate also told Tackney that he was bothered and made anxious by women in high heels who walked on hard floors. Think back to what Irene wore to church that night. Coincidence? Absolutely not. Fate went on to tell Tackney that he had a sexual compulsion to attack women from behind, especially when he knelt behind them in church. Even after that confession, Fate wasn't reported. Nobody called the police. Tackney later said he didn't initially report the crime because it wasn't his place to make a judgment. Now, I know all of us are going, of course it was. But you have to remember that this happened in the Catholic Church, and most members of the Catholic Church or the clergy believe that the Catholic Church is the highest authority, and you don't disobey what they tell you to do, right? So the 88-year-old said that he tried to counsel Fate to change his behavior towards women. It's what he could do at the time. Now in 2014, Tackney told 48 Hours, which 48 Hours did an entire piece on this case, and it is magical, and you should go watch it because they did such a good job. But anyway, Tackney told 48 Hours, quote, "I covered up the evidence and I'm sorry for what I did," end quote. Instead of, like I said, being turned over to the authorities, he was moved to Jemez Springs, New Mexico. Now, I'm going to put another trigger warning in here. We're going to talk about his behavior and the behavior of another priest who was there at the time. So if sexual assault involving children is going to affect you, skip ahead. It's not super graphic, but we are going to talk about it. So he was, like I said, he was moved to Jemez Springs, New Mexico, to the Servants of the Paraclete in 1966. While he was there, he was not supervised. He was the supervisor. And he supervised abusive priests and decided when they would be placed back in contact with children. I'm going to go off on a side tangent for just a second. One of the people that he supervised, and I use that term very loosely, was James Porter. I don't know if you guys have heard the name James Porter, but James Porter was a priest who had been caught raping boys and girls in Massachusetts. In 1967, Porter was sent to Jemez Springs and assigned to Father Fate. Now, Fate sent Porter out into New Mexico parishes 4 separate times. 4 times. And each of the 4 times, Porter was returned because he had molested boys. Most of his victims were Hispanic boys aged 7 to 10. And he was also caught sodomizing a boy in a full body cast. And Fate still continued to send him out to these parishes. He was also sent to Houston. And again, he was caught molesting boys. Now, after all of this, Father Fate wrote to Porter's home diocese and said, quote, "There had been no occurrence of the problem that plagued Father Porter in the past," end quote. So Fate reported to Porter's supervisors that he was fine and his behavior was fine, even though 5 times, 4 in New Mexico, 1 in Houston, he had been sent back for sexually assaulting children. I don't know if I can adequately sum up how much of a monster John Fate is. So when asked about Father Fate, Father Peter Lechner, the current head of the Servants of the Paraclete, said that he was shocked and disgusted that a priest with a criminal background made decisions about priests accused of sexual misconduct. Yeah, I think we all are. Father Joseph O'Brien, we talked about him earlier. Remember, he was part of the clergy at Sacred Heart. For all intents and purposes, he was Father Fate's probation officer during all this time. And he was even named a special investigator by the city manager of McAllen. So in December of 1971, Father O'Brien wrote the following note to the McAllen police. And I'll read it to you. It says, "Dear Chief, I have just received notice that John Fate left Denham Springs, New Mexico, and is now living in the Chicago area. He is seeking employment as a layman and will no longer function as a priest. This was his own decision and was not due to a problem. If any further information is needed, please feel free to call upon me." So this man, who the Catholic Church protected after he murdered a girl, was now out of the church. So, still no consequences. In 1972, still a free man, Fate left the priesthood, like Father O'Brien said, and married a woman that he met in New Mexico. They ended up having 3 children and moving to Phoenix, Arizona, and joining the St. Teresa Church. Now, Fate's brother was the priest at the St. Teresa Church. So while there, Fate became the director of volunteers for the Society of Vincent de Paul and advocated for the poor. He remained working to help the poor for 20 years. People who knew him said that he went above and beyond to care for the people that he served. And listen, y'all, I'm glad. I'm glad that he took care of the people that he served. I'm glad that they had someone taking care of them. I'm just really pissed off that it was him. That man should have been in prison a long time ago. However, his reputation probably explains why the Arizona Republic asked him to comment on the revelations about sexual abuse in the church. In 2002, to calm the outrage at revelations of sexual abuse and cover-ups, the American bishops decided that all allegations of sexual abuse should be turned over to civil authorities. Kind of like they should have been doing all along, right? Instead of hiding criminals and letting criminals supervise criminals and sending criminals back into places for more children to be victimized, but I digress. John Fate says, quote, "It has to be that way. It means that if someone is doing something wrong, they are not above the law simply because they are an ordained minister," end quote. Now, if that is not the pot calling the kettle black, like, I don't know about y'all, but that just irks me to no end and creates the fury bubbles in my guts. So during Fate's moves and the life that he lived and all of this that he did, the family and loved ones of Irene Garza saw no justice. None. Naomi Ponce-Stigler, Irene's cousin, told 48 Hours about the toll this case had on her father, Milo Ponce, one of the investigators who was originally on the case. She says, quote, "Later I found out that my daddy had been asked to turn in his records of the investigation of the case," end quote. That's when Stigler said she learned that her father had been ordered to stop investigating, and his superiors were going to take over the case. Come on. Many of Irene's family suspected that some kind of agreement had been made between the church and the authorities, even though there was no real hard evidence of that. Siegler said that her father never got over the case. Although she said he never lost his faith, he still never looked at priests the same way again. He felt so strongly about this that no Catholic priest was called for last rites years later when he was on his deathbed. And if you are Catholic or know anyone who is Catholic, you know how big a deal last rites are. Now, I want to circle back to Father Joseph O'Brien. I brought him up twice. He was in the parish that night, and he was also Father Fate's special probation officer or whatever. So Father Joseph O'Brien was the lead priest at Sacred Heart. Early on, the night of Irene's murder, he noticed something unusual. He told police that he had seen scratches on Father Fate's hands shortly after Garza went missing. So Father O'Brien saw the scratches and he told the police, he had scratches on his hands. He then continued to put pressure onto Fate about what had happened. Eventually, at the Obliates headquarters in San Antonio, Fate confessed to the murder. But O'Brien never reported that confession to law enforcement at the time. So he's now confessed to 2 different priests, and neither one reported him. Now, instead of reporting, like he should have, he told Irene's parents that if Fate had done anything wrong, the church would punish him, and that the church punishment would be greater than any sentence a court could give. O'Brien also feared the damage that the scandal would bring to the Obliates and worried that Fate might deny the confession and sue him for slander. Now, I want to remind you that that kind of thing was actually a thing back then. People did get sued for slander. I know that it's something that gets tossed around nowadays and it almost means nothing. But back then, that was a real thing. I'm not excusing his behavior. I'm just letting you know that he had a genuine fear. Now, it wasn't until decades later that O'Brien finally shared what he knew. He ended up eventually telling the police and Irene's cousin, Naomi, about Fate's admission. We'll get into that in a second. In April of 2002, Dale Tackney comes back into the picture. He ended up leaving the Catholic Church in 1967 and became a tax accountant in Oklahoma. I mean, that's an exciting career change, I guess. Now, he called the San Antonio Police Department and told a detective, George Sadler, about Father Fate's confession. Now, Detective Sadler could not match any of the details to any murder in San Antonio. Now, remember, it didn't happen in San Antonio. So, fast forward a couple months to November of 2002, and Texas Ranger Rocky Milliken was coming by the police department to pick a few things up. He stopped and started chatting with Sadler, and Sadler asked how things were going. Milliken said, they're busy, we're working on this cold case, and started talking about details of the case. As soon as Detective Sadler heard the details, he knew. Later that night, Detective Sadler spoke to Texas Ranger Rudy Jaramillo. Now, Ranger Jaramillo is retired, but for the sake of the case, I'm still going to refer to him as Ranger Jaramillo. For clarity's sake, I'm going to take just a second to explain a little bit about the Texas Rangers for those of you who don't live in Texas and didn't watch Chuck Norris in the 90s. No, I'm kidding. Most people are familiar with the legendary Texas Rangers. They're the elite investigators who handle major crimes like murder, public corruption, and officer-involved shootings across the state. They are often called in by local agencies when cases are too complex, high profile, they don't have the resources, And their role is to bring their experience and resources from the state to the toughest investigations. And they are the highest ranking investigators within the Texas Department of Public Safety. Now, within the Texas Rangers, there is a specialized group known as the Cold Case Unit. Sounds very Law and Order, I know, like bum, 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 bum. Anyway, so this unit was created on September 1st of 2001, and its primary objective is to provide Texas law enforcement agencies with a process for investigating unsolved murders that would appear to be serial or linked criminal transactions, anything like that. These Rangers focus exclusively on cases that have gone unsolved for years and sometimes decades. They come in and re-examine evidence with fresh eyes and new technology. They track down long-lost witnesses and follow leads that might have been overlooked in the first place. As far as jurisdiction goes, number one, the most important part is the Texas Ranger has jurisdiction anywhere in the state of Texas. However, as far as assignments go, there is a ranger that is assigned to every area in Texas. Every region, every county has a ranger that is like the eyes in the sky for their county. The cold case rangers have their own unit and do their own thing. Back to the case. Ranger Jaramillo spoke to Dale and believed his story. He thought that he had finally found his evidence that was going to knock this case open and get justice. Now, he tried to use technology to find more evidence, but because Irene's body had been submerged in water, there wasn't anything viable. Flashback to when I was telling you about finding the body. I said that we would talk more about the candlestick holders. So the report, or any report, honestly, that I found, because I read a few, they kind of just glazed over the candlestick holders. And they were mentioned that they were found with her body. However, when I was speaking to Ranger Jaramillo, he explained that they weren't really found with her body. He told me that the candlestick holders were floating in the canal, and a fisherman found them. That fisherman took them home and then gave them to a friend of his because he believed, hey, they might belong to Sacred Heart, and you go to Sacred Heart, have a gift. The friend then put them on the mantle, and that's where they stayed until Ranger Jaramillo took them into custody as evidence. Fun little fact about that, actually. The friend who had them on the mantle all these years had a son, and that son grew up to be a Texas Ranger. Weird little coincidence. So, as it turns out, Tackney wasn't the Ranger's only witness. Ranger Jaramillo also found Father O'Brien. Father O'Brien told the Ranger that he thought the scratches on Fate's hand looked like fingernail scratches. In fact, O'Brien said he was so suspicious that he and another priest searched the rectory for Irene on Easter. I mean, if you have a feeling that you are searching for a missing girl while hiding from the priest that you think abducted her, why are we not calling the police? Anyway, O'Brien finally told Jaramillo that during a confrontation back in 1960, Fate had made the crucial admission. He admitted to killing Irene. And then O'Brien also admitted that he knew he was dangerous. And that's why he got sent to the monastery. They weren't going to give him to the police, and they weren't going to kick him out of the priesthood. They sent him to a monastery after he murdered a woman and tried to sexually assault another one. So, with this new witness testimony, Ranger Jaramillo felt that he now had enough to arrest John Fate. I mean, he had two witnesses that said, yes, he did this. He admitted to me, we were there, whole shebang. However, insert bad guy number 6 million, Hidalgo County District Attorney Irene Garza did not agree. Garza says that the case was too old and the evidence was too weak, and he didn't want to reopen it. The police chief of McAllen at the time, Victor Rodriguez, told CBS that Garza never wanted to take the case from the moment that they tried to reopen it in 2002. Garza did not believe Tackney or O'Brien's statements. He said that there weren't enough specifics and some of the details they had were incorrect. Now, I don't disagree. There were some of the things that they said that weren't 100% correct. However, these men are very old, and this happened a long time ago, and it was horrific back then. The main pieces of the confessions were accurate and steady, and they corroborated each other. Some of the reports that I read say that the district attorney even went as far as to say that Ranger Jaramillo may have fed Tackney details. Now, I asked Ranger Jaramillo if he had actually said that to him, and Ranger Jaramillo confirmed it. He said that the district attorney said that about him. Of course, Ranger Jaramillo denies the accusations. He stated that every interview was recorded, and Garza had made comments about the sound of rustling papers on the recording. Ranger Jaramillo pointed out that, and you guys probably already understand this, investigators often have paper in their interviews. They have notes, they have crime scene photos, reports, etc. Like, you have to take notes in order to remember and document the information. But these recordings will come into play later, and thank God for them. So Garza didn't just step on the Rangers' toes during this investigation. Linda Delavina, Irene's cousin, said, quote, "And I'll never forget, he put his finger in my face and said, you know, you'll never get an indictment. You'll get one when pigs fly," end quote. I'm sorry, but as a district attorney, what the hell are you doing saying that to a victim's family? Anyway, in March of 2004, Renee Garza finally brought the case to grand jury after a lot of encouragement. The family got excited and felt like they maybe had won. I don't want you to get too excited yet, though. While Garza took them to grand jury, he never subpoenaed the two witnesses or John Fate. The jurors only heard audio tapes and saw transcripts, and in fact, the only person from Sacred Heart that came to testify was Elena Sanchez, and she was the church's secretary and a defense witness in Fate's trial for Maria America. In June of 2004, the grand jury declined to indict John Fate for the murder of Irene Garza, which is no surprise because the district attorney did a half-assed job. With that, the police closed the case again. Media organizations had asked to see the investigative file, like an open records request. Garza threatened to prosecute the police chief, Victor Rodriguez, if he revealed the material because Garza claimed there are some things that have to be kept secret that just cannot be put to print. Now, false. There is something in America called the Freedom of Information Act, and that's when you request open records information, and they have 10 days to get it to you or provide you with a valid reason why you can't have it. But I digress. To Irene's family, this felt like it may be the end, and they felt like they would never see justice. Ranger Jaramillo was also told to stop working on the case. He told me that after the grand jury declined to prosecute, he was told not to continue to push the district attorney in an effort to not sour the relationship between the DA's office and the ranger assigned to Hidalgo County. There have been many situations in Texas where a relationship between a district attorney and a law enforcement officer goes bad, and the DA starts to refuse to take cases from that officer, and that effectively ends their career. Now, Ranger Jaramillo understood why he was being told to back off, and he didn't want to put the Hidalgo County Ranger in a bad spot. However, he said he couldn't let go that easy. He continued to work the case on the down low because he knew the evidence was there and he wanted justice for Irene. He continued to investigate even after he retired in 2012. Fast forward to 2014, and it is time for the re-election of the Hidalgo County District Attorney. Irene Garza was running again, per usual. However, there was a new face in the race. Ricardo Rodriguez was also running for district attorney, and justice for Irene was his goal. Rodriguez went on to win the election in an upset, ending Guerra's 32-year run as district attorney. In the days following the election, Guerra had the nerve to reach out and ask Rodriguez to appoint him as special prosecutor in the Garza case. So all of these years of not wanting to prosecute Irene's case, and now that he's no longer the district attorney, he's asking to be appointed as a special prosecutor. My first question is, why is he so adamant about being part of this case or part of covering up this case? Why does he need his hands on it so bad? So Irene's case was reopened in 2015 by Hidalgo County Mike Garza. No relation. When Mike Garza was asked by 48 Hours if his Catholic faith made this case more difficult for him, he said, "The church seeks to do good. It is the men in the church, and the men at the time did that wrong." Irene's case was taken back to the grand jury, and an indictment was actually returned at this time. The indictment said that the grand jury found that fate, quote, did and there with malice and aforethought caused the death of Irene Garza by asphyxiation, end quote. John Fate was finally arrested on February 9th, 2016 in Scottsdale, Arizona. When he heard he was going to be extradited all the way back to Texas, he told the Arizona judge that he would be fighting the extradition. The Arizona judge then set a bond of $750,000 cash only. Good luck, John. In the next hearing, he said, all right, I'll just go back to Texas and face the charges. So he did. He was extradited back. Fate's trial for the murder of Irene started on November 30th, 2014. The story of the priest accused of killing a parishioner was finally being heard in a courtroom after almost 60 years. Father O'Brien had died at this point, so his audio tapes were introduced. Remember how I said those would end up being very important? There it is. There were also other accounts from women who had been around Irene's age that had a strange encounter with fate as well. Father Thomas Doyle, a leading expert on clergy abuse, analyzed a letter between members of the Catholic Church hierarchy for the jury. He said, quote, "I believe I found in every paragraph some element that I found very unusual, but pointed to an attempt to cover this up or make it go away," end quote. When asked if he would testify in his own trial, John Fate declined. 8 days later, after 6 days of testimony, on December 7th, 2017, the case had been presented and was now in the hands of the jury. Ranger Jaramillo believed that ADA Garza did a wonderful job and presented a solid case, and all there was left to do was wait on the jury. Mike Garza told 48 Hours that he was confident that they had the right jury in the box, but he also admits to getting a little nervous after the first 2 hours. After 6.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. John Fate was found guilty. The jury's verdict read that Fate was found guilty of the offense of murder with malice and aforethought. After the verdict was read, Naomi Ponsigler said justice was served. Irene finally got her day in court, and that's all we wanted. Linda Delavina said, quote, "After 57 years, we have found justice for Irene, and for today, pigs are flying," end quote. I love her. Oh, I love that. The morning after the verdict, it snowed in McAllen. If you're not from Texas, that is something very unusual. McAllen is about 20 minutes from the Mexican border. It doesn't snow down here often. So that same day, the jury decided they were going to announce their decision on sentencing, and they sentenced John Fate to life without parole. John Fate then died of cardiac arrest in prison on February 12th, 2020. The entire time that I spoke with Ranger Jaramillo, I could hear it in his voice. The weight, the commitment. He remembered every detail of the Irene Garza case like it happened yesterday. Names, dates, facts, never missing a beat. When I asked him how it felt to finally hear the guilty verdict against John Fate, he sighed. He told me he'd investigated countless cases over the years: murders, sexual assaults, crimes against children, gangs, but nothing had ever stayed with him like Irene's case. He said when the verdict was read, it was as if a weight was lifted off his shoulders and he could breathe. Ranger Jaramillo shared with me that he was raised Catholic. He understood how painful and complicated this case was, not just for the community, but for the church. But he told me he had to separate his personal faith from his duty as an investigator. He said just like in any profession, there are good clergy and there can be bad clergy. His goal was simple, and it was to find the bad one in this case and bring him to justice. And for him, it was always about justice for Irene. Irene, before her death, had written to a friend and said, "I pray to God that I will love him as I should, because many times I feel myself wanting to rebel against him, especially with all the sadness in the world. But I know that I am just a human. He is so much smarter than I. Who am I to question his ways? God didn't make things easy for us." The murder of Irene and the cover-up that followed is a stark reminder of how institutional power can obstruct justice. The Catholic Church protected Fate for decades. Law enforcement failed to act when they should have. And yet, persistent advocacy by Irene's family, journalists, witnesses, and a retired Texas Ranger led to justice, even though it was delayed. Irene Garza's case had become a symbol of resilience and the pursuit of truth in the face of institutional betrayal. The eventual conviction of John Fate shows us that persistence matters, advocacy matters. Irene Garza's legacy is one of resilience and unwavering pursuit of the truth. All right, y'all. Thank you for spending time with me today. If you are crocheting along, I hope that this was a space where you could process and reflect while still feeling comforted. Next week, we're going to dive into another case, and we'll put all of our squares together in our sunflower tote. Don't forget to follow Murder She Crocheted on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, at Murder She Crocheted on all of those. We are on Twitter, but on Twitter we are at MSCPod. Character limits. You can also check us out on Pinterest. I have a Pinterest board that will have the free patterns featured in every episode, and then another board that has just some more fun free crochet patterns. I want to hear from you though. If you have a case suggestion, a listener story that you want to tell me, and that could be anything. Murder, spooky, anything you want to tell me. Pattern ideas, reviews, ratings, things that you would like to see me change or do differently. Email me at murdershecrocheted@gmail.com. Now, this is my first podcast. If there are things that would make it a better experience for you, let me know. I want to know. You can DM me, email me, whatever. Also, don't forget to tag me in your projects. If you're making things with me, I want to see what you made. Post a picture, tag the podcast. I want to see all of your beautiful creations. So, until the next twisted tale, stay crafty and stay creepy.